Hello, everybody. So today I want to talk about toxicity. A very interesting topic, as it is a very nuanced topic to really discuss, as with many things out in the world. And I want to sort of discuss this alongside Mr. Scott Jund over here. For those of you who don't know, Scott Jund is a Dead by Daylight live streamer slash YouTuber. He does that primarily. He does other things, but for the most part, those are the things that he tends to do, and what he's kind of known for at the moment. A lot of opinions, and makes a lot of videos, and about, builds and all that stuff, maybe not super typical Dead by Daylight streamer, but, slash YouTuber, but yeah. And so I made this toxicity video, and while there are certain points that are agreeable to the video, there are certain points that aren't necessarily agreeable. I'm not going to go over the entire video to waste your all's time. We are going to go over some of the first bit, about 35 seconds in, to really hammer home a particular point, and then we can go on from there.
I guess the first thing we should go over first is what actually is toxicity. To me, in terms of like online games, that word has sort of lost all meaning. The reason is, I think the definition of a word should never be a subjective thing, and yet the definition of toxicity is subjective. When you ask somebody, you'll get a different response almost every single time. So I think that sort of means that the meaning of the word has sort of lost itself. The definitions of words should not be subjective. They should just be, this is what this word means, and that's it. That being said, I tried to get a unanimous answer from my chat, and it seemed like the rough sort of response was, generally toxicity, at least in video games, is just sort of going out of your way to make someone feel bad.
So, and he goes on about that last thing a bit, so again, we're not going to watch the full thing. But so, first thing, he has a problem with toxicity being subjective, being this overly broad thing that anybody can really latch onto and consider that. And then he has a problem with words not having very definitive meanings, and that feels that words are therefore useless. I don't think so. I think words would actually be less powerful if they didn't have the nuance or subjectivity that they had. Take, for instance, the word happy, or in the opposite land, sadness. The thing is, if that was a really definitive term where we could use and say, happiness is this thing, that would be really awkward and kind of just wrong to innately do. Because there are some people who would consider happiness to have a roof over your head, where other times happiness is like being able to die on a Dark Souls boss over and over again. I guess that makes it a little bit more so than nuance. But happiness is obviously something that is incredibly subjective. The same thing with sadness. What makes me or you, Scott Jund, sad, or maybe got a tear in our eyes, is incredibly different than ourselves. So that's why words should have a subjective barrier to it. Because if not, then whose definition are we really going to apply happiness to? Is everybody supposed to fall under this line? The same thing can be very decently applied to toxicity, because just by the sort of definition of it, where we can see here extremely harsh, malicious, because all this other sort of stuff is involved, the toxic element, the poisonous element, but this extremely harsh, malicious, or harmful. And that or part is going to be very important here, or with what he's going to do later, but harmful or harm per se is an incredibly subjective thing. What is considered harm to somebody might be considered nothing to another person. We can even go up a knot and say that certain things like slurs, which I'm sure many of us would consider a toxic or harmful thing to do, might not affect the particular slur that it affects. A very close instance of this is the C word, the Cracker Barrel word, when it relates to white people, per se. People might get offended because of the recent sort of outcry that I did make a video on and whatnot, but plenty of people take a slur like that and not really care all too much. But that is just one example, with plenty of other people will get offended by that word. The same thing can be applicable to every other race, creeds, or whatever the case may be. Is that there are plenty of people who do get offended by those things, and there's plenty of people who don't, because they view that these things aren't an intrinsic harm to them. This does not mean we should discount those people who do find these particular terms harmful, but that's the thing. that's the weird part of where it feels like Scott John wants this word to be, that it needs to be this sort of thing we can clutch onto. But again, just like happiness, just whatever, whose definition should we follow in this case? Like, if you're bothered by this word, and the thing is, like he has his own definition, and then he's bothered by that he can't have the definition of toxicity seemingly be surrounded by him, and therefore it bothers him. But that's the whole point of certain words, that they should have that subjectivity material matter to them, so that we can engage with each other's experience and not really have to, dissuade people from their own experiences. So that's one point, is that I think that toxicity should have this subjective material to them, because if not, then it's easily to tell somebody, well, somebody said a slur to you, big whoop. It's words on the internet, whatever. Or what happened with the whole Bubba and the face mask thing. Somebody gets offended by the whole blackface situation, like big whoop. Grow up. Like, does that really make sense to really be able to do that? If we want to have a really definitive definition of a word, I don't really think so. But moving on, what's very important about the word toxicity is, like I said, go back to it, the or part of this particular definition. Or. So that means these words can be in tandem with each other, harsh, malicious, or harmful, but they don't have to be next, is the important bit. And so something can be inherently toxic without malicious intent, which is what Scott Jun seemed to get from the various round of peoples he's talked to in his community about this, is that there has to be some form of ill intent attached to it, when in reality there does not need to be. There can be malicious or bad intentions involved, but there also doesn't have to be. This is where we can sort of differentiate when it comes to video games, the difference between um, toxicity toxic gameplay, and toxic people who can be interlocked with each other, but at the same time, it also can be one or the other. Because some people can engage in fine gameplay, but be an asshole themselves and engage in toxic things that are inherently harmful. Oh, but at the same time, somebody can be engaging in a toxic gameplay element and not inherently have any intention to do so. In Dead by Daylight in particular, there are certain circumstances that allow for these two particular things to intertwine. Basement Bubba, I think, is a particular example of somebody who has a decent intention to not care about the other person's time or whatnot, because of how that gameplay style is and what the main intention for a gameplay style like that is. The same thing could be said with the boil over play styles that we saw when boil over got changed. Where people had dedicated teams directly to do that type of stuff. And there were even some play styles like that, using certain boons, certain maps, and all those things to really make the other side feel like shit. I mean, I would equivocate that those sort of gameplay styles to say in a game like World of Warcraft, on a PvP server maybe, where a level 20 gets ganked by a level 60, or whatever the cat might be. Classic WoW would be 70. Classic BC 70. 70 ganking a level 20. There is inherently no cost benefit to do such a thing other than to be a dick. And it's very toxic and harmful gameplay, because person who's getting ganked isn't feeling good at all. So we can differentiate those two as well as have the same type of dealio. Because the thing is, when it comes to intrinsic things within games, there are going to be toxic elements within it that cause people to be upset. The problem is that people don't know how to differentiate that toxic gameplay with the person doing the toxic gameplay. Because if somebody camps or tunnels, there's no real way to intentionally know if that person is really trying to hate the other side to a degree, or if they're just trying to win. Because a lot of times, ways to win can be considered these toxic elements. Camping and tunneling, as very fervently showcased by Arts Dava's experiments, are very easy ways to win. Even if you give yourself a disadvantage in this game, those are very decent and easy ways to win, despite them more often than not being degenerate playstyles, or, I should add, what Scott Jun would refer to as boring playstyles. styles. He doesn't engage in these said play styles because they're boring to him. Now the thing is, he's using boring as sort of an adjective for what he would describe these particular actions. But I think we could replace boring with toxicity because boredom or boring and those types of words are very negative behaviors. They really are. They're not behaviors that anybody would say, yeah, that's a positive behavior. In fact, those are behaviors that actually could, in fact, get people to stop playing a game. Because the whole point of a video game is for you to be entertained. And generally, the opposite of entertainment is boredom. And if you're encountering that type of shit too much, that might get you to stop playing. So, that's what I would consider what Scott Jun would normally refer to as boring to be something that's toxic because it's inherently giving a harm to him. Now, I don't know if he might view it that way now, but I believe that these two things are incredibly similar. Just like when he talked about Boilover before it got changed, of how it, or changed again, I should say, that it was a very toxic perk in a sense, but he called it boring because it led to non-interactive and not really much things to do that caused him to have a not great time. But he used boredom, and again, it's weird because again, you could say a toxic in replace of boredom, and you can go a step further with the boil over group of people and say that there's an intentionality for that group of people to be intentionally toxic, intentionally harmful to the other side, to a degree, and you wouldn't exactly be wrong but when we talk about intrinsic things in games, like the bowl or change, or something that's really deep within Dead by Daylight, which is camp and tunneling, that these are things that we as players should, of course, voice all the time about how awful these things are. Because these things exist in almost all games. Whether it's a particular champion in League of Legends that is just broken beyond belief, or like a couple champions usually is the case because you could just ban that champion. But if that champion is like being banned 100% of the time, there's obviously a problem there. But or in Hearthstone, where a deck becomes so predominant, even if it might not be the best, or it creates a very boring experience. I mean, recently on Hearthstone, you had the uninteractive meta, which plenty of people considered the most boring meta there probably was because of how couldn't interact with the opponent's side whenever they did their combos and stuff. Like that would be considered a toxic gameplay element. And again, very fervently clarify this: to say that somebody playing Pirate Warrior in Hearthstone, or to say that somebody's camping and tunneling in Dead by Daylight toxic is true, but it's not true to really insinuate that the person who does these types of things are toxic as well. Can have these things intrinsically different because there does not need to be that malicious intent in order for something to be toxic. And I know this might annoy Scott because it's not an objective way to view things, but that's not the way the world works. The world is way more nuanced and stuff when it comes to a lot of these words. And again, if we want to have it be in Scott Junn's world where each word has to be defined, definitive, then again, whose definition are we following? If we look at these words, what is the definition of happiness then? What is the most happiness somebody could have? What is the definition of sadness? Who can be sad and who can't be? Like, you understand how this would be very hard for, of course, Scott Jun to present to people on trying to explain away how any of these words can be not subjective. So, in essence, and I should say, at the end here, he says something that generally allows for the most malicious toxicity and sort of that type of sense, to sort of being able to just ignore that type of stuff, to sort of get rid of it so that those people don't get high off their own shit or whatever. I tend to agree with that generally. But again, people react to certain things differently, and it's really hard for a lot of people, because this happens enough, to really sort of disengage from that shit. But it's harder to avoid the gameplay toxicity when it comes to games, which is, again, why it's up to developers to recognize and understand what inherently in their game is toxic and really try to make ways to deal with that. I mean, the change to boilover that came after the change to boilover was one of those things. But, clearly the devs of Dead by Daylight need to do a bit more when it comes to intrinsically changing their game. Aim when it comes to like camping and tunneling, where those things either need to be as niche as possible to really be whatever, or to disincentivize, or to maybe fundamentally change their game so that these unfun things that I do think have a negative impact on the player base need to change. This doesn't, again, intrinsically mean that those people are bad who do those things because they're doing things to win. Yeah. To avoid myself repeating myself the same again, I will say that I enjoy Scott Junn's content and I enjoy his thought process and all this stuff, despite myself disagreeing time to time. And I hope you, of course, give him a good old scrib. And I hope to talk to you all later. Goodbye.